In the third video, we will study the colliders, their characteristics, and learn how to add and configure them. We are also going to see how the Rigidbody component works. So let's get started. Let's start by eliminating the scenario except the floor. I'm interested in comparing the sword with other primitives, so I select the sword in the hierarchy and move it to another position outside the pedestal. We create a cube and a sphere, and let's look at the properties of the cube in the inspector. We see that it has several components separated by a line. In particular, there is one called box collider. We are going to remove this component. Click on the little gear in the upper right corner and then remove component. Now let's add the collider again manually. Click on the Add Component button and in the search bar type collider. There are several types of colliders designed for different purposes. At this point, we are going to see three types of them: box collider, sphere collider, and mesh collider. Select box collider. We see that the edges of the cube change to green. To better observe the collider, we are going to disable the mesh renderer component. The collider fits exactly to the geometry of the cube. Let's move on to the sphere. Disable the mesh renderer component to observe the collider. Now let's see what happens with the sword. Unlike the cube and the sphere, this object doesn't have a collider set by default. So first we are going to add a box collider to the sword. As you can see, a green cube was generated with the minimum size capable of holding the object in its volume. Now we select a sphere collider. In this case, the diameter of the sphere is approximately the length of the sword. Let's add now the mesh collider and disable the mesh renderer. We see that the collider is now based on the geometry of the objects. This means more accurate calculations but also a higher processing overhead. Finally, we are going to add a mesh collider to the clock, but this time we click on the convex checkbox inside the collider properties. Now the collider grabs the entire object but with a simplified geometry. Let's test this scene. I select the character and bring him a little closer to the objects, then click on play. The character can't go through the objects that have colliders. If we disable the box collider component of this cube while we're still in play mode, we see that the character can now pass through it. Let's do a quick review. Colliders can be added using the Add Component button. We saw box collider, sphere collider, mesh collider, and convex mesh collider. We also saw that a collider can't go through another object that has a collider. Now let's talk about another useful component offered by the engine. It's called Rigidbody. Let's move the sphere to a higher position. Now click on Add Component, go to the Physics tab and click on Rigidbody. In the properties, we see that we can assign a mass, enable or disable gravity for this object, among other things. Let's click on play to see what happens. The sphere moves as if it were affected by gravity. It also collides with the edge of the cube and ends up rolling on the ground. The character can also interact with the sphere due to his own collider. The Rigidbody component has several properties and functions of classical physics, like speed, impulses, linear and angular momentum, forces, and more. Let's talk a little bit about the prefabs and their instances. Select one of the prefabs and drag it to the hierarchy. I also zero all the components of the position and applies those changes. The prefab has its own parameters defined, and each instance that is made will receive those parameters. The components of the instance can be modified, but this doesn't affect the prefab itself, unless we click on the Apply button. Only then the properties of the prefab are updated. Let's put colliders in the rest of the prefabs. Click on Add Component and type Collider. Select Box Collider and test the scene. Of course, this collider is not appropriate. Click on the Edit Collider icon and using the green dots that appear, you can edit the dimensions of the collider. Let's add two more box colliders and edit the geometry to match the two other walls. A configuration such as this serves to delimit the boundary of the object. However, for simplicity, I will remove the three box colliders and place a mesh collider instead. As I mentioned before, modifying an instance of a prefab doesn't modify the prefab itself. When we select the prefab, we see that unlike the instance, it doesn't have the collider. To solve this, select the instance with the collider and click on the Apply button. Now the prefab is updated. Let's add mesh colliders on the rest of the prefabs and apply the changes. Look at the geometry of the gate. It's not justified to use here a mesh collider. For what we need, a box collider is enough. Edit the geometry to cover only the structure. We will also use a box collider for the pedestal. The clock is going to be a collectible object. In other words, when the character is close enough, the clock will disappear. So to achieve this, we are going to use a sphere collider, and we click the Is Trigger checkbox inside its properties. Simulate quickly to understand the idea of using a collider as a trigger. The character can pass through objects that have colliders in trigger mode. The utility of this is that we can know if a collider touches another that is in trigger mode. We will use this later to program the behavior. I'm gonna adjust the radius of the sphere collider, and that's it for now.